Hello, everyone. I hope you can all hear me. Thank you for joining us. My name is Valdete Berisha, and I manage the AgriFin webinar series here at the World Bank's Agriculture Global Practice. I'm happy to welcome everyone on behalf of the AgriFin team. For those of you joining for the first time, welcome. And as always, I'm also very happy to see many familiar names. This is extremely important to us as it indicates that our webinars continue to be a valuable and useful knowledge sharing event that so many of you continue to come back. So welcome back. To give you a quick background, the AgriFin webinar series invites agriculture finance professionals to share their insights and lessons on a wide range of topics related to agricultural finance. Today, we're going to hear from Jean Saint-Geours, economist with a trade and competitiveness global practice of the World Bank Group. Jean will talk about recent initiatives supported by the World Bank to reform warehouse receipt systems in Africa. He will provide an overview of the key reform initiatives and how they help facilitate agricultural finance, reduce post-harvest losses, improve the stability of market prices, and stimulate agribusiness development. More specifically, I've asked Jean to discuss the following. First, what it means to have an effective warehouse receipt system, and what role does the World Bank and other public and private sector actors play in creating one? What are the opportunities for financial institutions to use warehouse receipts to increase lending to the agricultural sectors? And what are some of the key lessons that we can draw from the implementation of the World Bank projects in 4 African countries? So before we get into the presentation, I would like to note a few important things about the webinar format. A lot of you may be already familiar with the format, but it's worth repeating just for those who are joining for the first time. We'll start with Jean's presentation, which will take about 30 minutes. Then this presentation will be followed by a Q&A session with a speaker for about 20 minutes. I encourage you to not wait until the end, but to send your questions in throughout the webinar. And excuse me, we unfortunately, because these events tend to attract large numbers of attendees, we cannot allow the use of microphones among participants, as that would make it extremely difficult, if not impossible, for us to ensure sound quality. So I encourage you to write your questions during the presentation in the chat box located in the lower right-hand corner of the screen. I will do my best to collect and ask all the questions at the end of the presentation. And as always, we keep the webinar length to 1 hour. So the webinar will end at 10 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time. So if there are remaining questions that we don't have time to answer, there will be plenty of opportunities to follow up with the speaker afterwards or with the AgriFin team. So once again, thank you for joining us, and I will turn it over to Jean to start his presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Valdette. So as you mentioned, my name is Jean Saint-Geours, and I will be talking to all of you about warehouse receipt system reform initiatives in Africa, performed at the World Bank Group, and notably the Training Competitiveness Global Practice. So I'm gonna give you a short introduction to warehouse receipt systems, then talk about our approach to warehouse receipt system reform. Talk about success factors for the banking industry and our support to banks. Briefly describe our ongoing initiatives in Côte d'Ivoire, Kenya, Malawi, and Senegal, and then conclude with lessons learned. So I'm sure that most of you know about the way warehouse system works, but I'm just going to walk you through a simplified version of it. So it all starts with depositors, so people who have agricultural goods that they want to store. They can be producers, cooperatives, traders, processors, anyone with agricultural goods. And so they bring the commodity to a licensed warehouse operator. So the warehouse operator has been licensed to issue warehouse receipts. And that operator is going to issue a receipt that's going to state the quantity, the quality, of the goods, and this receipt is going to be the title of ownership to the goods. And without this document, no one will be able to get the goods out of the warehouse. That is one of the responsibilities that licensed warehouse operators have, making sure that the goods cannot leave the warehouse without showing the receipt. After that, if the depositor decides to use the goods and the receipt to get a loan from a bank, he or she can bring the receipt to a financial institution that will then issue a loan using the warehouse receipt as collateral. The depositor remains in charge of selling the goods, and so in doing so, he will have to go and approach the market, for instance, traders, processors, or any sort of distribution network, and then sell the goods to the market. The market will have to pay the financial institution in order to retrieve the receipt. And here, to simplify things, we assume that the financial institution also pays the warehousing fees and other handling fees to the warehouse operator, and whatever is left between the amount of the loan and whatever the amount was paid by the market to the depositor. After this has been done, then the market or the buyer can bring the receipt to the operator, the warehouse operator, and retrieve the goods. So it's fairly simple. But why is it so important? And so, as many of you know, access to finance in the agribusiness sector is often the lowest in many developing countries because, of course, you have natural level issues of high levels of informality, but one of the primary barriers for banks to extend financing to the agribusiness sector is the inability to secure reliable collateral. In agricultural finance, you typically have three main options to extend financing. Either you have someone mortgage farmland, or mortgage or lease equipment, or you have charges or pledges over post-harvest production. The first two are the most significant in developed countries, but they are often out of reach in developing countries. As you may know, especially in Sub-Saharan Africa, even though people have owned land, it's very hard to have a land title, and it would be very difficult for a bank to come and repossess the land if there is a default. Similarly, agriculture is poorly mechanized, and so there's no equipment to mortgage or lease. So that leaves us with the lending against stored goods as the only real viable option to extend financing to the agribusiness sector in many geographies. But in order to do that, banks need to be able to perform three things: verify, value, and control. They need to be able to verify that the goods exist and that they actually belong to the borrower. They need to be able to value, meaning that they need to have an assessment, a fair assessment, of the amount that the borrower is likely to receive when the goods are sold. And that's why, for instance, in the case of a warehouse asset system, usually the value of the loan is about 55 to 80% of the value of the goods deposited to cover for the risk of fluctuation of the price of the goods. And then they need to be able to control. They need to be able to ensure that the goods or their proceeds will be used to repay the loan. And so different options exist in order to be able to verify value and control. We have stock monitoring agreements where you mostly verify and value. In this case, the bank will employ an auditor to periodically visit the farm, the warehouse, or the processing facility, and determine the quantity and the quality of production on hand, and examine the books and records to verify that all input suppliers have been paid. You also have collateral management agreements. In this case, you can verify value and control. And the bank will employ a collateral manager to guarantee the continued existence and control of the goods and report the valuation on a current basis. But in order to provide this guarantee, the collateral manager will normally require that the goods will be deposited in a storage facility that he or she is controlling. And finally, you have a warehouse receipt system, where you can also verify value and control. As we've seen in the short depiction of how the way it works, the goods are deposited in a warehouse that's authorized by local law to issue warehouse receipts, and issue warehouse receipts to the bank, showing the quantity and quality and location of the goods. And the law will actually provide that the holder of the warehouse receipt is the legal owner of the goods and has the sole right to authorize the warehouse to release the goods and has the right to sell the goods by delivery of the warehouse receipt to the buyer. So the benefits of the warehouse receipt system are the following. So as we've seen, warehouse receipt systems, they help create a framework for movable collateral on stocks owned by farmers, traders, and processors, but held in licensed warehouses. And they can do so with very little additional costs in terms of implementation, because as you've seen, it's really a legal and regulatory construction that provides value without requiring much capital outlay. They also provide ease of transfer of title, because as we said, you just need to sell the goods, sell the warehouse receipt, or pledge it without having to transfer possession of the physical goods. And this provides additional liquidity to producers, traders, and processors. And it's also an additional safety for banks, because in comparison to stock monitoring agreements or collateral management agreements, warehouse receipt systems offer legal protection against claims of competing creditors, and you don't have to employ an auditor or a collateral manager. And of course, as we said, the ease of loan liquidation, because in the event of default, the bank can simply sell the warehouse receipt. Finally, it can lead eventually to be part of a commodity exchange, because commodity exchanges require the ability to settle contracts with physical delivery of goods, and it is pretty impractical without warehouse receipts. So countries that establish warehouse receipt systems are in a position to improve access to agricultural credit and to help professionalize agricultural storage. And these, in turn, are critical to reduce post-harvest losses, to improve the stability of market prices, to ensure food security, and to encourage formalization of businesses in the agribusiness sector. So what is it that we do when it comes to helping introduce warehouse receipt systems? So the World Bank Group, through the practice that I work for, the Trading Competitiveness Global Practice, provides technical assistance to policymakers to introduce appropriate legislation and institutional frameworks to implement warehouse receipt systems. But the work that we do on legal and regulatory frameworks, often complements the work done by other of our colleagues, like the support provided to banks by the IFC and its Global Warehouse Finance Program, the efforts made by the Finance and Markets Global Practice on introducing secure transactions regimes or helping set up commodity exchanges, and the assistance given by the Agriculture Global Practice to agricultural production. And so our approach is the following. We start with a very sturdy, robust readiness assessment, and then we worked on legislation and regulation, sensitization and training, warehousing industry supports, and trading platforms. When it comes to the readiness assessment, it's clear that there are different paths to success when implementing a warehouse system, especially in Sub-Saharan Africa. Some of them are contract-based, like the system in South Africa, and you have millions of tons a year that transit through the system. And you also have legal and regulatory systems like Ethiopia and Tanzania, with hundreds of thousands of tons each. Yet, we've seen this fail as well in other countries, and so this similar path can also lead to failure, and so that's why we're very specific when it comes to assessing whether there's an opportunity to introduce a warehouse system, and we make sure that some critical conditions are met. It's especially true for commodities that are likely to be used. You want to have commodities marketed in the country that are easily storable, because then why would you use a warehouse to begin with if you can store them for a long time? You need to make sure that the volumes that are marketed are sufficient to cover some of the costs incurred through a warehouse receipt system, and that they will generate enough business for warehouse operators and for banks for them to be interested in participating. You need to make sure that the price patterns are suitable for delayed marketing. In a lot of situations, everyone harvests at the same time, let's say for maize in country XYZ, and so that will depress prices at the time of harvest. But using A warehouse to store the goods will help equalize supply and demand and will improve price patterns. You also need to make sure that you have grading standards in place in the country that you're targeting, or at least some incipient version of that, so that people know that when you deposit the goods made, let's say, still in a warehouse, and you have a warehouse receipt issued, what does it mean that it's of quality X, Y, and Z? You need to have some form of price transparency, because as we said earlier, banks need to be able to value the goods and the warehouse receipts, and for that you need to have some understanding of what the borrower is likely to get from the sale of the goods. And then last but not least, you need to make sure that the likelihood of market intervention, especially from the government, is fairly unlikely, because when you change the rules halfway through, and because the warehouse receipt system is really dependent on the trust of stakeholders in the system, there's a risk that the system will collapse. So for instance, if all of a sudden there's an export ban or an import ban, then the economic equation of I lent you, assuming a value of 100, but now suddenly the good only worth 20, is going to make a lot of people default on their loan. A second element is to try and understand where the potential users of the system stand. It's really essential to make sure that the main public and private stakeholders, that is the users, the potential warehouse operators, the banks, the insurance companies, the public entities, will strongly support the warehouse receipt system. Because without such strong support, it's very unlikely that we'll get off the ground. So in terms of users, the potential interest that they may have tend to be, for producers, the opportunity to lower post-harvest losses thanks to improved access to professional warehousing, accessing insurance coverage, because the warehouse operators would have to have insurance coverage, and that is something that is usually not available to producers. And of course, take a higher price from delayed marketing, like we just discussed. For traders, it's the ability to increase access to trading and financing opportunities. For processors, and this is a problem that we've seen in a lot of countries, it's the opportunity to lower the financing cost of working capital. In a lot of processing businesses, you need to secure raw material, that is agricultural commodities, at a certain amount of time, but then process these commodities throughout the year. And so by using warehouse receipts, it's a way to lower this cost. And then for all actors across the board, it's an improvement of product quality and market transparency. Then we look at the warehousing industry, also a key determinant to whether warehouse systems are viable or not. You need to determine what are the storage capacities, what would be the transportation needs for users, are they far or not from production areas. You need to assess the quality of facilities. Are the banks going to trust that they are of quality that's sufficient to extend financing against receipts that deal with goods stored in those warehouses? They need to be accessible to third parties. In a lot of places, they are owned by, let's say, traders, but who are not really interested in opening them to third parties. So even though they exist, they can't really be used for a warehouse system. Another key element is the quality and reputation of storage practices. And I've seen this recently in a country in Southeast Asia, where you had the capacities, but banks tended not to trust the storage practices, and therefore it seemed very unlikely that they will be willing to extend financing against warehouse receipts emanating from those warehouses. It's very interesting to look at what are the current collateral management and fill warehousing practices, because it's a good indication of whether people are used to this concept. And in general, talking to stakeholders in the warehousing industry is a way to gauge their openness to the warehouse receipt concept. Another element that we need to look at is financial institutions. And this is one of the really key aspects of the readiness assessment that we perform. We tend to meet with a lot of banks trying to determine what's the status of agri-financing, what's the proximity of their branches to production areas, because it's going to be very critical to the success of the system, and we'll talk about this later on. And also look at their current practices and openness to collateral-based financing. And that gives us usually an indication of their interest in the warehouse receipt system concept. If it is completely foreign or if they had bad experiences, it's likely that we're going to suffer in or that we should not even engage. Another element is institutional capacity. Are there competent institutions to implement and regulate an efficient and reliable warehouse receipt system? Is the judiciary equipped to deal rapidly and effectively with priority and enforcement issues under a modern warehouse receipt system? Is there an authority or body of government officials which is capable of enforcing rights of holders of warehouse receipts? And so all of these questions really have to do with if we put the system in place, will it work efficiently or not from an institutional capacity standpoint? And finally, we try to assess the financial viability of warehouse receipt systems. Because, of course, they're wonderful and great, but they do come at a cost. You would have warehousing fees for depositors because warehouse operators are, of course, not in the charity business, so they will want to charge fees for their business. You have financing costs because, similarly, financial institutions need to make a profit. But you will also have regulator fees because you need to regulate and operationalize the system. And you will have other costs like IT and server costs if you want to have a robust trading platform. So once we consider that, okay, this place, this geography, this country has the chance of making it, and when we do that, by the way, it doesn't mean that all of the elements that I mentioned are at 100% level, but that we just try and identify what are the deal breakers. So once we conclude that there's momentum and there's an opportunity in a place, then we started providing technical assistance to introduce the appropriate legislation and regulation so that we can create a legal instrument warehouse receipts that constitutes document of title to the goods that we've discussed since the beginning of this presentation, deposited in a warehouse. We'll help define issuers of warehouse receipts and determine what are the responsibilities towards warehouse receipt holders as well as their lien. What can they expect also from the system in terms of making sure that their storage fees and handling fees will be paid. We also define what are the conditions and repercussions of negotiating and transferring the warehouse receipt. We also provide technical expertise and assistance to whatever regulatory unit will be used to supervise the warehouse receipt system during its startup phase. Another critical element of what we do is that we try to build stakeholders' understanding of the warehouse receipt system and to support them by organizing sensitization events and workshops for all stakeholders from the public and private sectors, but also by providing training, and it's notably important for the banking industry so that they can adjust their procedures and be part of the warehouse receipt system efficiently. We also try to support the warehousing industry. We help them develop operational guidelines for the supervised private warehouse operations. We provide assistance to warehouse operators so that they can strengthen their operations and meet the guidelines that have been set to be granted a license. And we try and mobilize and facilitate private sector investment so that the professional storage facilities can be improved in the country. We also engage with stakeholders to explore options for a warehouse receipt trading platform. So now I'm going to talk briefly about what the success factors are for the banking industry to succeed in this field. First of all, it starts with having a very clear high-level strategy for what they want to accomplish when it comes to warehouse receipt financing. And that means knowing the commodities that qualify for warehouse receipt financing, the warehouse operators with which the bank is willing to work, the commodity quality requirements that they impose, have a clear sense of what is needed from the enabling environment factors, and to identify the targeting clients. And with the work that we do with them, engaging them in building the legal and regulatory framework, we also help address some of these issues and frame the debate on all of these elements. Then banks really need to secure skilled and well-trained staff, including loan officers, and customer relationship managers, and bank operation officers, who have a solid knowledge of trade and commodity finance mechanisms, the types of commodities, market structure, factors determining prices, and typical seasonal patterns, the warehouse system regulations and rules and procedures that we just mentioned, and of course knowing the business models of the borrowers and their operating environments. There's also clearly a need to implement a robust market monitoring and price information systems, so that the banks will have access to data and news on the markets for relevant commodities and meet factors influencing prices, so that they can adjust the loans that they offer. There needs to be a systematic collection and internal dissemination of applicable interest rates, and we've seen in multiple geographies that this was not always the case, of the loan portfolio by commodity and value, and the availability of funds for credit per season. And in the identification of monitoring and internal sharing of a commodity reference price, so that you know how to price the warehouse receipt, and therefore you know how to price the loan. And there's clearly a need for designing a specific risk management and mitigation strategies for risks related to warehouse receipt financing, because risks, of course, are plentiful. They include borrower credit risk, structuring risk, market and price risk, currency risk, operational risk of the bank, and this is typically the case for middle office risk, performance risk for the warehouse operator, legal risks, and government intervention risk. But this assessment of risk should not also obscure the fact that there needs to be a dedicated loan pricing strategy for warehouse receipt loans. And this pricing strategy should take into account potentially lower costs and lower risk, and therefore better rates. Because the collateral is managed by a third-party warehouse operator that's under the oversight of a regulatory agency. Because the financing is following an agreed loan-to-value ratio and is granted against a specific commodity on which price information is available, so you don't have to reinvent the wheel every time you issue the loan. And also because, according to the way the warehouse system works, the recovery of the loan is supposed to be relatively easy in the event of default. You just need to sell the receipt. Finally, last but not least, but it's been something that's been overlooked in a lot of places, is that even though the headquarters, the main decision makers are supporting such initiatives, there needs to be a clear dissemination strategy and marketing strategy at the branch level. Because it's an opportunity for the bank to increase exposure to actual clients, but it needs to be clearly communicated to bank branches in the region, so that they know how to interact with those clients, and also convince the clients that this is an interesting opportunity. And so any further information that you need on the challenges and opportunities for banks can be found in the IFC's Warehouse Finance and Warehouse Receipt Systems, a guide for financial institutions in emerging economies. So what is it that we do to support banks? We provide training sessions specially tailored to banks and to warehouse receipt financing. So we will expand on the key success factors that I've presented briefly before, and we walk them through concrete cases so that they know, okay, if X, Y, or Z happens, what should we do? But we also provide liquidity for on-lending and risk mitigation through the IFC's Global Warehouse Finance Program. There's both a credit line, where the IFC offers short-term loans to banks, which on-lend the funding to commodity depositors against warehouse receipts used as collateral. And there's the funded-unfunded risk sharing, where the IFC guarantees up to 50% of short-term loans extended to commodity depositors against warehouse receipts used as collateral. So we have, right now in Sub-Saharan Africa, the focus of this presentation, we have 4 projects. So we have one in Côte d'Ivoire that was launched in 2013. And the Warehouse Receipt System Bill was passed by Parliament in July of 2015 for the first time in Francophone Africa, so we were very excited about that. And we're in this project, similarly as the one as what we're doing for the one in Senegal, we have a clear focus on harmonizing good practice warehouse receipt system laws and with the Ivorian and the Hoara legal environments. We have invested a lot on sensitization events to raise stakeholders' awareness of the warehouse system. And right now we're assessing the warehousing capacity in the country, and we're also about to launch a pilot in which a set of banks can help provide financing against receipts to cashew processors. Because as you can see, the specificities of this particular project is that the cashew value chain was chosen as a pilot as part of a more comprehensive World Bank Group program to develop this value chain. We also have, of course, challenges. We need to secure more funding to conduct activities that go beyond the legal and regulatory framework. And we constantly need to raise awareness so that we can secure support of stakeholders with vested interest status quo. In Kenya, the project has been in place for, I think, since 2012. And we already have the warehouse receipt bill that has been endorsed by Cabinet and is now before Parliament for deliberation. In this country, we already run a pilot, and we already have 2,000 depositors in 14 pilot warehouses. 5 banks are participating, and then they're already lending against receipts. So here it says $4 million, but we actually now close to $5.5 million in lending. We've invested a lot in building capacity of warehouse receipt stakeholders like operators and financial institutions, providing the trainings that I mentioned earlier. And we are performing a study on the impact of warehouse receipts on structured trading and lending. We have a very close partnership with the East African Grains Council that is leading the pilot, and we also collaborate with AGRA and financial sector deepening. Right now, we're trying to focus on exploring arrangements for making state-owned warehouses accessible to depositors as part of the warehouse system, because they're based in strategic locations, and they will be very useful to scale up our warehouse system effort. We're also noticing that there's an emerging issue of the high cost of credit for farmers, and we need to find ways to help banks lower their rates thanks to all of the perks that I mentioned earlier. In Malawi, the situation is quite similar to the one in Kenya, although the project is more recent. We have the bill that's been drafted and it's before Parliament, but we've already seen a massive increase in lending and people participating in the warehouse receipts, because they expect that the legal system will be in place soon. So we already have 1,500 depositors. The quantity stored went from 10,000 tons to 30,000 tons, and the 6 banks participating in financing warehouse receipts at the moment went from $500,000 to $9 million of financing against receipts. We're working on a study tour. We performed, a study tour to South Africa and India so that our clients and stakeholders can understand and learn more from the operation of warehouse system elsewhere and commodity exchanges. We have a very strong partnership with the 2 commodity exchanges in the country, so that we can link the warehouse system to their exchanges. And we work with First Initiative, USAID, GIZ, and the EU. Right now, one of our main concerns is to secure more funding so that we can also help with, let's say, for example, propping up the warehousing industry by helping them with guidelines and trainings and such. The last project I will talk about is the project in Senegal that was launched in 2014, and that focuses on the pilot in the rice sector, more specifically the rice in the Senegal River Valley, and then more broadly across the country. So here again, we have the warehouse system bill that's been drafted by stakeholders, and stakeholders from the public and private sector, so meaning producers, traders, processors, banks, insurance companies, warehouse operators, collateral managers, and also all of the relevant public entities like the Ministry of Justice, Agriculture, Industry, Commerce, Finance. And so here, just like in Côte d'Ivoire, we're making sure that we have harmonized best practice warehouse receipts laws with the local legal context, including, of course, the Senegalese legal context and the ORA environment. And right now we have finance support from First Initiative, GAFSP, and the government of Japan, and we're working with USAID to have a project that will support warehousing infrastructure and warehouse financing information systems. We need to continue our efforts in raising awareness when it comes to receipt financing, and we also have to overcome some institutional capacity constraints. So here, and I don't know if this presentation will be distributed later on, but you have the contact of our project leaders in case you are interested in any of these projects. And I will now conclude with some of the lessons that we've learned in working on this field. It's clear, and I hope that I conveyed this, that warehouse-assisted systems are both very simple on paper, but actually quite difficult to successfully implement in practice. You have, in a lot of places, vested interests that need to be overcome, and you also have a wide variety of stakeholders that you need to mobilize to gather support and momentum for reform. And so that's why our modes of implementation vary in each country to build this momentum. In Côte d'Ivoire and Senegal, we had specific value chains that were chosen as pilots, cashew in Côte d'Ivoire, rice in Senegal, because there was strong interest and a need for warehouse system as part of this value chain. Whereas the warehouse system was being developed, has been developed in close partnership with the East Africa Grains Council in Kenya and with the two commodity exchanges operating in Malawi, and in both cases, these institutions expressed a clear need for warehouse receipts to be introduced to help them expand their activities. What is very clear also is that this is what we try to do, that legal and regulatory reform is a great opportunity to engage stakeholders, build their understanding of the warehouse-assisted system, and get them excited. And this was particularly true with, and this is what we do, focusing specifically on banks and financial institutions. We want them to be part of the thinking, part of building the legal regulatory framework so that they will feel comfortable in participating. Because we need to make sure that we create legal instruments and practices that make the system secure. However, many other challenges exist beyond this legal and regulatory framework and that need to be addressed to make sure that it's a success. We have to work towards providing market transparency and clear outlets for the stored goods, because if you want to liquidate your receipt, you need to be able to sell it to someone. We have to help promote adequacy of storage infrastructure and trust of marketplace and storage practices. Otherwise, depositors will not come deposit their goods. Banks will be very reluctant to lend against the receipts. And this is a clear incentive to implement more comprehensive programs as I've described, and even more importantly, to combine forces with others. So we've included components on certification and training, assistance to the banking and warehousing industries, and traded platforms into our warehouse-assisted system reform projects. And we really seek to build alliances where our colleagues from the World Bank Group, of course, and from other projects, but also with partners in country. And that is especially true for the private sector that we work in close partnership with. And of course, we take the support of other donors. And that's the end of my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jean. Thanks for a great presentation. I have several questions, actually many questions that have come in throughout the presentation via the Q&A and chat box. So I'm going to start with the first one, which is asking if it's possible to talk a little bit more about the cost of implementing warehouse system projects similar to the ones you talked about. You mentioned the resources that are needed a little bit during your presentation, but if you, the question more specifically is if you can provide the estimated amount that the World Bank spent to support one warehouse receipt system and the time frame that it took to do that. So I'm not sure if that's something that you can specify.
Well, thank you very much for the question. Yes, it is. It's hard to give a definite answer on this particular subject because, as we've seen throughout the presentation, you could there's no limit to what you could and should mobilize to help the system be successful. Right now, in the project that I've described, we're focusing mostly on technical assistance to help the government reach its goals, and the support we provide, let's say, on improving storage infrastructure and practices. It's more about facilitating private sector investment or public-private partnerships. So the project can go to a few millions to mobilize the right legal experts and to provide continuous support to the government in making sure that all of the relevant stakeholders are mobilized and that they understand that they will participate in the system, to dozens of millions of dollars if you really want to help with feeder roads or storage infrastructure or setting up maybe even a trading platform. So it's hard to give a final answer, but that I hope that paints a clear picture.
Thank you. So the next question is about you talked about initiatives in Africa. So there's a question about whether you know of any models of warehouse receipt systems in use in Latin America, or more generally, if there are any good examples of warehouse receipt systems that can serve as role models for warehouse receipts.
Yeah, so it's very clear that Latin America is, I would say, much more advanced when it comes to commodity-based financing than Southern Africa is at the moment. And of course, the best example when you think about the American companies in general is the United States, that has had a framework for the past 100 years and has been dramatically successful in implementing that. I have to say that the World Bank Group's efforts at the moment, or in the past, let's say, few years, has been on trying to support commodity-based financing by supporting the introduction of commodity exchanges that can link with warehouse systems or similar systems.
So the next question has to do with information systems. What are the information systems that are needed to support the efficient implementation of these warehouse receipt systems? And also related to that was another question about the role of technology. So what role does technology play in the operations and implementation of warehouse receipts?
So there are multiple aspects to this question. You have a need for, let's say, most of the stakeholders involved to have the support of some version of an information system that can help them track how the warehouse system is working. At the regulatory level, you need some system to track the receipts that have been issued, canceled, the request for duplicatas, and that can take the form of a paper central registry. But more advanced and better practice is to actually have an electronic warehouse system that will have some electronic platform that will help the regulator track the different transactions. Then at the user level, if we take the example of financial institutions, then they will need to be able to interface with this let's say centralized electronic warehouse system to have a clear understanding of past transactions, of what are the stocks available throughout the country. But they will then also need to be able to adapt their own information systems to how to manage extending loans against warehouse receipts, and that can be quite an endeavor. Of course, at the warehouse operators level, you also need to be able to connect with if there is one, the electronic warehouse receipt system, because you want to make sure that whenever you issue a receipt, the system will be informed, and that will be taken into account so that you have protection, and then you provide protection to both depositors and then eventually buyers of the receipt. So throughout the system, there's a need for information technology and tools, and there's also a need for the depositors themselves to have a sense of the current prices and what they can expect from their goods. And that can be achieved at the warehouse level, because then they can tell what were the past transactions for similar products, but that can also be organized through mobile solutions like we can see, let's say, in Kenya with M-Pesa.
Great, thank you for that answer, Jean. So the next question has to do with the role of private companies. So the question is, how are private companies able to enter and support the market for warehouse receipt systems? And so do you see a role for them?
Well, actually, not. I mean, I hope that this is what I contain in this presentation. Not only do I see a role, it's actually the main key success factor for a warehouse system to flourish. And as I mentioned in the section about readiness assessments, this is a role that we have to play as trading competitiveness, is to make sure that we understand what private sector stakeholders think about the potentiality of the introduction of a warehouse system, and whether there is momentum on their side, so that we can then link them with public sector stakeholders, so that the warehouse system that's introduced will make enough room for private sector operators to participate, and will leverage as much as possible their willingness to contribute. And they can contribute at almost every level. Of course, potential depositors can contribute by expressing the needs that they have in terms of the quality and the location of the warehouses, about the way loans should be structured, whereas operators and control managers can help manage the warehouses, provide indication on what should be the guidelines for granting licenses for warehouse operators under the system, and of course provide support by opening their warehouses to third-party storage and seek to get the licensing agreements that they need to issue warehouse receipts. And last but not least, and it's one of the main focuses of our efforts, financial institutions have a huge role to play, because if they are not interested in extending loans against receipts, then the system becomes almost moot. And so that's why we have expanded more on what we're doing towards them in this presentation, because they're really key stakeholders that can help make the system work.
Great, thank you. So the other related question is actually related to how the warehouse system model works. And it's one of the participants is asking, would it not be more efficient for the warehouse to get sufficient inventory finance to be able to pay depositors a proportion of the value of the commodities that they're placing for storage, with a balance paid on sale of the commodities, I guess, as opposed to providing finance directly to the depositors from financial institutions, if I understand it correctly?
Well, I mean, that is sure an interesting thought. However, it's not always the role, right, of warehouse operators to be in the business of selling goods. So in that respect, it's not really clear whether this would not create the wrong incentives for the warehouse operator to act both as the storage provider and also the representative of the depositors in terms of selling their products. And also, we've seen that if you want to maximize the impact of the system, you also want to allow warehouse operators to actually own store their own goods in the warehouse. And if you do that, then if they're also in charge of selling the goods depositors, it creates even more perverse incentives. Um, um, but it's of course an interesting model that could be explored.
Great. So the next question has to do also with the actual model and how it works, and it's asking whether you can provide more detail on how and from whom the warehouse owners and operators recover their capital and operating costs.
So, can you who recovers the cost?
Sorry. So the question is, can you provide more detail on how and from whom the warehouse owners and operators recover their capital and operating costs?
Thank you. Sorry about that. Yes, so warehouse operators will operate just as storage providers, and in the sense that they will charge fees for all of the tasks that they perform as part of this service. Meaning that it will be handling fees. If there's a need to dry or clean the products, that will probably also be charged, and they will charge for the time and space that's taken by each depositor for storing the goods. And these fees will be paid by the depositor and or the person buying the receipt. One follow-up or one additional detail on this is that one of the costs that can be prohibitive for warehouse operators is the ability to secure insurance coverage for their activity for performance guarantees, and so that in a lot of projects we also try to work with the public sector and future warehouse operators to find solutions that will bring this cost down, be it an indemnity fund or setting up an indemnity fund or other solutions.
Great, thank you. So the next question has to do with regulator, the role of the regulator, and it's asking whether it makes sense to have the securities regulator also regulate commodity exchanges and warehouse receipts, or should there be a separate regulator for warehouse receipts?
So in a lot of the places that we operate in, there are no commodity exchanges at the moment. But it's true that in a lot of countries, the commodity exchange also manages the supervision of the warehouse asset system. And what we've come to realize is that introducing a warehouse asset system and where you're supposed to locate the regulatory agency will really depend on the political economy of that country and what makes more sense. In a place like West Africa, the options that we're exploring really differ from one country to the next, for instance. So it would be hard for me to give a definite answer on this. But what we've clearly seen in places that have strong commodity exchanges is that it's actually done in tandem. The commodity exchange will have a role in supervising warehouse system because it becomes the main client for warehouse receipts.
Thank you. So the next question has to do with the current projects that you're working on, and the question is whether there are when are the pilots in Côte d'Ivoire and Senegal scheduled to end, and if there are any other pilots planned to be implemented.
So at the moment we have pilots going strong in Kenya and Malawi. Like I said, in Kenya the pilots have managed to facilitate more than $5 million in financing against receipts from participating financial institutions. In Malawi, we're now at $9 million. The pilot in Côte d'Ivoire is being implemented in the sense that it's not operational yet, but it's targeting this current harvest for cashew. And the pilot is, I mean, the end of the pilot is really when the system can be introduced in a full-fledged fashion. In Kenya and Malawi, we're waiting for the law to be passed. That's why we developed the pilots to garner the momentum that was gathering from financial institutions and stakeholders alike. And it's a similar system in Côte d'Ivoire, where we're now waiting for the regulations to be passed. In Senegal, which is the last in terms of the project that started last, we're now done with the legal and regulatory framework work, and we're looking into what kind of pilots we could introduce. And it's likely to start with the Senegal River Valley, but this is really early stage.
Perfect. So we have one last question, and I think we're approaching the end here. So we will wrap up everything. And the last question has to do specifically with a warehouse receipts readiness assessment tool that you mentioned earlier. So the question is, would it be possible to get the warehouse receipts readiness assessment tool? Is this public?
So there is actually, I guess I failed to include it in my presentation. We are about to publish a guide to warehouse receipt financing reform that includes the whole module on the readiness assessment and how it should be conducted, but also how to launch a project and how to make it successful. And so this will be published in the next month or two. But I should insist on letting people know that it's a mix of set rules of what you need to follow and a bit of art. And so, as described in the toolkit in the guide, there's a clear need to mobilize experts who have experience in this. Because it's not always easy to identify what could be the pitfalls going forward. But there's a tool coming up soon.
Great, thank you. Perhaps I can ask you when the tool is published, if we can share it with our audience, because I'm sure there are going to be a lot of people interested in getting that tool. So we will work with Jean to find out a way how we can best share this tool and make it available to you in the next few months when the tool is published. So with that, we've come to the end of the webinar, and I just wanted to thank Jean again one more time for a great presentation and for answering all of the questions. And as it's a common practice with our webinars, we will make the recording of this webinar and the PowerPoint presentation available on Agrifin's website within the next 2 days. So we'll send you an email to let you know when it is available. And before signing off, I would also like everyone, if you could take a few seconds to complete a very short survey that is going to appear on the screen on the right-hand side shortly. So if you can take the survey to just let us know what you thought about the webinar presentation and overall the webinar. In the meantime, if you have any remaining questions, please feel free to send us an email or visit Agrifin's website at agrifin.org. And finally, I would also like to invite you to register for our upcoming webinar with Root Capital, which is scheduled for next week on March 30th. I will include a link to this to the registration page shortly in the chat box if you want to go directly and register now, given that the webinar takes place just a week from now, actually less than a week from now. So please feel free to register. Root Capital is a nonprofit social investment fund that lends capital, delivers financial training and strengthens market connections for small and growing agricultural businesses in Africa and Latin America. And so our speakers will discuss Root Capital's business model with a focus on what banks and other agricultural financiers can learn from it. So please feel free to register, and we hope to see you there soon. And finally, on behalf of the entire Agrifin team, I would like to thank Jean once again for contributing to knowledge exchange through this webinar. We hope that the lessons shared today will help strengthen your approach to agricultural finance and to the overall understanding of warehouse receipt systems. So thank you, Jean, for taking your time from a very busy schedule to speak with us today, and thank you to all participants for joining us.